To say hello to you and bring you a little bit of insight on what happened for you or to you, as the case may be, in Tallahassee over the last session. It was certainly an interesting session. Probably, I've only served 3. Dennis served 8, and would probably rank among the most interesting of any of the 8 that you served too. We faced a $6.5 billion budget deficit when we went into session this year. So that's obviously unprecedented. I mean, that's a very difficult thing, a difficult call to place over a session as you go into it. It's important to put that into perspective. Many states are struggling. If we budgeted California's, if we transpose California's numbers to equal that size of Florida's budget, we would have been going into Florida's year with a $20 billion deficit if you compare the size of California to the size of Florida. So that's the size of the trouble that California's in. I mean, nearly close to bankruptcy. So comparatively speaking, among the big states in the union, we're holding our own. But there's no question that dealing with a $6.5 billion budget deficit was the biggest challenge, and we passed more than half as many bills, just over half as many bills as we usually pass, and that was another example of the fact that we just didn't have any money to spend. The more important question is, how did we deal with that $6.5 billion deficit? And I'll spend a couple minutes talking to you about that because that dominated so much of the attention. And it's important to understand the difference between the federal government and the state government, because at both levels you hear about budget deficits. In Congress, if you hear about a budget deficit, they've already spent the money and they're going to send you a bill for it. In the state of Florida, we're constitutionally mandated to balance the budget. So that's why it posed such a difficult challenge for the legislature, and that is because we can't borrow to make up that deficit. You can there's only 2 options. You can either raise revenues or cut expenses to meet a budget deficit. How do you get to a deficit like we're experienced? And that is basically, when we budget every year, we budget based on revenue projections. We have full revenue estimating conferences every year. The only thing we know about a revenue estimating conference is that the projection is going to be wrong. For the years prior to the first few years I was in the legislature, and the years prior, it was very nice that we kept being wrong on the good side, and we were taking in more money than we estimated we would be taking in. The last 2 years, we have been wrong very badly on the bad side, and we're taking in a lot less money than we estimated that we would be spending. So what that means is, when we estimate how much money is going to be coming in, the revenue collections actually were less, and we're stuck with the deficit of dealing with the fact that we spent but to that budget amount, and we've got to either reduce expenses or cut revenue. How did we deal with the $6.5 billion shortfall? And the process is both the House and the Senate go through a process of adopting their own budgets. They're usually very different. This year they were very, very different in their approach to dealing with that $6.5 billion shortfall. The House budget was spent about $1 billion less. We were really focused on what we considered to be a 3-year budget. We wanted to put a lot of money into reserves and not spend and reduce spending in state government, so that in the 3rd year we would still have a balanced budget and we wouldn't be forced to be raising revenue again. The Senate spent $1 billion more than we did. They proposed higher tax increases. We proposed higher fee increases. Both of us raised about $1 billion worth of revenue from either taxes or fees. At the end of the day, we have to come together and merge those 2 concepts into a budget. And what did we end up with? We ended up with a budget that certainly raised some level of fee increases, tag fees, hunting licensing fees, court access fees, things like that. We also passed a tax on cigarettes, an additional surcharge on cigarettes. And the biggest chunk of the deficit makeup came from the federal stimulus money, and I want to talk in a minute about that, because that was a very conscious decision on behalf of the legislature to whether to take that stimulus money or not. As you know, the federal government passed a huge federal stimulus bill. We put about $3.5 billion of those stimulus dollars into the budget this year. that is a complicated thing to take on. And many of us, myself included, argued not to take it. Many of us argued to say, let's just go ahead and bite the bullet while we've got it, reduce government spending, and not take those dollars. Why? Because that money runs out in 2 years. I remember when I served on the city commission in Lakeland, my first year, my first or second year, and Jim, you guys will remember this, we were dealt with replacing a bunch of positions in the Lakeland Police Department that had been grant funded by federal dollars for a period of time. Those federal dollars ran out, and the city commission was faced with having to either fund those positions or fire those people. That's what we're going to be faced with in 2 years in state government when the $3.5 billion and the $2 billion that we'll take next year to balance the budget runs out. We either have got to hope that the economy recovers significantly enough to replace that revenue, or we're going to be faced with a pretty big budget hole. So a combination of pretty significant reductions in spending to the tune of about $1 billion, $3.5 billion in federal stimulus money, and increase in fees and increases in that cigarette tax are how we ended up balancing the budget. The biggest decision that was made on the expense side was not to make reductions in the K-12 funding system, the FEFP, the education formula that funds K-12 education. So as you can see there's a pie chart on the little thing that we sent you, that we put out on your table. You can see that education is one of the biggest chunks of our budget. It's more than a third of the budget. So when you make the decision to leave that one whole and not make reductions there, you're forced with some pretty tough decisions in the remainder of the budget if you're going to try to make reductions, which we were forced to do. But overall, I voted for the budget. I think the only thing I did not vote for in the myriad of things that we increased, I did not vote for the expansion of gambling. We proposed a pretty dramatic expansion of gambling and a new compact with the Seminole Indian tribe, which will contribute funds into the budget next budget year and the years following that. I did not support that piece of the puzzle. Going forward, we think that actually revenue collections have stabilized, and the last few months we've actually beat the projections a little bit. So we think that at the end of the day we did enough work in this budget to not be forced with having to do something like raising taxes again next session. Can't make any promises we don't know what's going on in the third year, but certainly in next session we think that it's going to be a fairly similar year to this budget. But I just wanted to give you a general picture of where the budget was, because it's a very daunting task. It took us an extra week, actually, because the two budgets were so far apart, and conference was a complicated process. We were in session a week longer than we usually are, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing when you are faced with a historic budget deficit. A few things that I worked on are in some of the information that we've given you, but I want to talk about one because it's been covered a lot in the paper, and it's a position. Oops, can you hear me? I want to talk about one that was a fairly controversial position that I've taken. I want to tell you why I am where I am and where I think we're going, sort of in the energy arena. I've been talking to you for several years about energy policy because in my term in the legislature, that's an area that I have focused a lot of attention on, and some of this conversation has its roots in my time on the city commission here, when, again, my years on the city commission, we were faced with huge increases in the cost of natural gas. That cost was passed on to the ratepayers of Lakeland in dramatic increases in their electric utility bills. And at the end of the day, Florida is experiencing the same thing statewide. We are headed to 50% dependent in this state on natural gas for the production of electricity in our state. That's a huge policy consideration. When we take all new coal generating facilities offline and we only allow us to expand through natural gas, hopefully nuclear in the outrun, but in the short term, we're headed towards 50% dependent on natural gas. That's a dramatic thing to do to ratepayers in our state, because natural gas, while it's a clean burning and efficient and readily available source of power, is traded on a very volatile market, and the supply side is very short. There are only two